بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد النبي الأمي وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا. So last week we were mentioning that Abu Ayyub Ansari radiallahu anhu's grandson and great-grandson, when their nasab was mentioned, they were attributed to him as Ayyub bin Khalid bin Abu Ayyub Ansari radiallahu anhu. Even though Khalid was not the son of Abu Ayyub Ansari, he was actually the son of Safwan, and his mother was the daughter of Abu Ayyub Ansari radiallahu anhu. But what we had mentioned at that point was that it was considered a great honor to be from the family of a great Sahabi of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So the father, Safwan, also had no objection against his own son being attributed to his maternal grandfather, as opposed to the general and the standard that when a nasab was established of any child, it was always going back to the father. So this just tells us the level of adab and respect and reverence they had for their elders, for the Sahaba Ridwanullahi Majma'in. The other last thing we mentioned was that he had a nephew by the name of Abu Sawra, and he also had a bondsman, a slave by the name of Aflah, who had 3 sons, and all of them were considered thiqah, authentic narrators of hadith. Some of them narrated very few, but they were still classified by the muhaddithun as authentic narrators. As opposed to the nephew, though he was from his family, he was considered majhul, which means unknown, and his rawayas, all of his narrations, or most of his narrations, are all considered matruk or munkarul hadith, that his hadith is rejected. Which tells us that the muhaddithun, when they used to filter the hadith, they would not evaluate each narrator on the basis of his connection, that who he was related to, who was his kin. They didn't care if that person was a son or a grandson or a nephew or a cousin of a Sahabi of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. They didn't care if he was Sayyid or not. They only cared about one thing, and that was preserving the ahadith of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Even sometimes there would be a narrator, and he had a father who also was a narrator of hadith. The father himself was considered the da'if narrator. So somebody asked the son, what is your father in terms of his grade as a narrator? So he put his head down and then he said, my father is da'if. He's a weak narrator. Because preservation of hadith came before even our relations with our family members, before anything else. And these are the type of sacrifices that our elders made for preservation of hadith. One of many thousands of sacrifices that they made. Anyhow, we were talking about Aflah. Aflah was his slave, and he had many sons who also became the mawla of Abu Ayyub Ansari radiallahu anhu. So once it happened, and this hadith just shows us the love that Aflah had for his master, Abu Ayyub Ansari radiallahu anhu. It says that أن أبا أيوب كاتب أفلح على 40,000. There is a contract that's known as mukatabat. It's a contract that takes place between the slave and the master, in which the slave is allowed to do business on the condition that he will pay a certain amount of money in that business to the master so that he could be given his freedom. So Abu Ayyub Ansari made a contract with Aflah of mukatabat. A contract signed saying that Abu Ayyub Ansari radiallahu anhu will free Aflah, who was raised by Abu Ayyub Ansari radiallahu anhu. on the condition that he would pay him 40,000 dirham. If he paid him 40,000 dirham from his business, then Abu Ayyub Ansari would free him. So when people found out that Aflah was given this contract with Abu Ayyub Ansari, يُهَنِّئُونَهُ وَيَقُولُونَ لِيَهْنِكَ الْعِتْقُ أَبَا كَثِيرٍ. Congratulations. Aba Kathir was Aflah's kunya, his agnomen. So they said, congratulations, patted him on the back, gave him big hugs. Soon you're going to be a free man. You just got to pay 40,000. And he was wealthy, so it wasn't hard for him to pay it off. So they were very, very happy for him. So Abu Ayyub Ansari radiallahu anhu, when he made this contract and he returned home, he kind of felt regretful because he had raised Aflah like his own son. And he loved him dearly. And he's thinking now, I'm going to let go of him and Aflah is going to be gone. He's like, my son is going to leave me. In those times, masters and slaves were not like the way slavehood was a very strong institution here in the United States. An institution of racism, whose effects we see till this day. Right? The hatred is still there. The anger is still there. It wasn't like that. The relationship between a master and a slave was very different. It was like a father and a son in many ways. You took care of them as if they were your own family. As if they were your own family. So, فَلَمَّا رَجَعَ أَبُو أَيُّوبَ إِلَىٰ أَهْلِهِ نَدِمَ عَلَىٰ مُكَاتَبَتِهِ. When Abu Ayyub radiyallahu anhu returned home, he put his head in his hand and he said, I made a big mistake. I shouldn't have made this contract with Aflah. I'm going to lose my son. So he sent a message to Aflah and he says, Inni uhibbu. He's not forcing him. Listen to the words. Inni uhibbu an turudda alayya al-kitaba wa an tarji'a kama kunt. I would like if you return the contract. In other words, you break the contract with me and return to your previous state. Remain my bondsman. So he's saying, I would like. He's not forcing him. Your choice. Now he has a choice at this point of saying, no, too late. It's been signed and it's done. Now I'm going to pay you and I'm gone. So his family, Aflah's children, his wife, they said, أَتَرْجِعُ رَقِيقًا وَقَدْ أَعْتَقَكَ اللَّهُ. Do you want to return a slave when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has freed you? So Aflah says, look at his response. He says, Wallahi, la yas'aluni shay'an illa a'taytuhu iyah. If he asks me for anything, I will give it to him. I don't care what it is. He asks me for my soul, I'll give him my soul. I'll give him whatever he asks for. فَجَاءَهُ بِمُكَاتَبَتِهِ. He came with the contract in his hand to Abu Ayyub Ansari radiyallahu anhu, and he ripped the paper right in front of him to show him it's done. I am yours again. ثُمَّ مَكَثَ مَا شَاءَ اللَّهُ ثُمَّ أَرْسَلَ أَبَا أَيُّوبَ. A little while later, Abu Ayyub Ansari then felt bad again. Why did I do this? I shouldn't have done this. If I had already signed a contract with him, then I should have let it gone through. And look at the way he acted, that, I broke my part, but look at him. Just to please me, he came back and he ripped it all up for my sake. He could have been a freed man. He could have, refused. He didn't. So Abu Ayyub radiyallahu anhu felt really bad. So he called him back a few weeks later and he says, Anta hurrun wa ma kana laka min malin fawalak. You are now free and all your wealth is yours. He was very wealthy, had a business. All that business was technically Abu Ayyub Ansari radiyallahu anhu because he was his mawla. He said, no. The wealth is yours and you have your freedom as well. Go on your way. So it tells you the connection Aflah had with Abu Ayyub Ansari. Many of the rawayas that you will see in different hadith books, when you see Abu Ayyub Ansari, look in the sanad, you might find Aflah in there. If not Aflah, one of his sons. There's also one of the Tabi'een. Tabi'een means the third generation after the Sahaba. So after the Sahaba is the Tabi'i, and then after them is the Tabi'i. So Aflah had a grandson. His name was Umar bin Kathir bin Aflah. So it's mentioned about him, Umar ibn Kathir ibn Aflah al-Madani, Mawla Abi Ayyub Ansari. He's the Mawla of Abu Ayyub Ansari, meaning from the family of Abu Ansari through Aflah, who was a Mawla of Abu Ayyub Ansari. It's said about him, thiqatun, he was an authentic narrator. ذكره ابن حبان في أتباع التابعين. There's another one of his sons, this was his grandson. There was also a son of Aflah whose name was Abdul Rahman. Abdul Rahman, who was also the son of Aflah and the Mawla of Abu Ayyub Ansari radiyallahu anhu. And the interesting thing about this Abdul Rahman ibn Aflah, this just tells you what the institution of slavery was all about in the time of Islam, in Islamic history, as opposed to how we would think of it considering the times that we live in and what we know about all that we study about slavery and social studies, right? Right? All racism and oppression, right? So Abdul Rahman ibn Aflah was Radhi' of Kharija bin Zayd ibn Thabit Al-Ansari radiyallahu anhu. Radhi' means one who has been nursed by the wife of Kharija bin Zayd ibn Thabit Al-Ansari. So, do we know who Zayd bin Thabit is? Radiyallahu anhu. Zayd bin Thabit radiyallahu anhu is the Sahabi who Abu Bakr Siddiq and Umar ibn Khattab radiyallahu anhuma called after the death of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam to collect the verses of Quran Kareem and compile it into a mushaf. They put all their trust in him because Zayd bin Thabit was a katib, a scribe of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Whenever Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam used to receive a revelation, he would call Zayd bin Thabit. He had many katibs, but one of the main ones was Zayd bin Thabit radiyallahu anhu. Zayd bin Thabit. So Zayd bin Thabit radiyallahu anhu, he had a son whose name was Kharija. This Abdul Rahman ibn Aflah was a Radhi', meaning that he had been nursed by the wife of Kharija bin Zayd bin Thabit al-Ansari radiyallahu anhu. Now why would this slave boy, little boy, a child, be taken by a son of a Sahabi into his home and his wife is taking care of him? And by the way, this Kharija, his mother, Zayd bin Thabit's wife, her name was Sa'ad. And she was the daughter of a great Sahabi, Sa'ad bin Rabi' radiyallahu anhu, who was a great Sahabi from the Ansar. If you remember, he was martyred in the Battle of Uhud. He was one of our shining stars a couple of years back. Sa'ad bin Rabi' radiyallahu anhu was a very wealthy Sahabi. And if you remember the story of Abdul Rahman bin Auf radiyallahu anhu, when he came to Medina Munawwara and Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam established muwakhat, ties of brotherhood between the Muhajirin and the Ansar, Abdul Rahman bin Auf and Sa'ad bin Rabi'ah were both tied as brothers by Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And Sa'ad bin Rabi'ah had told him, what? I have a lot of property, I have a lot of land, I have a lot of groves, I'll half everything and give you one half and leave one half for myself. I have two wives, take whichever you want, I give talaq to her, she completes her iddah, you can take her as your wife. He was wealthy. He was martyred in the Battle of Uhud. After he died, his daughter, this Sa'ad, was still not born yet. She was still in her mother's womb. She was born after Sa'd bin Rabi'ah was martyred in the Battle of Uhud. Abu Bakr Siddiq radiallahu anhu took her in, adopted her as a daughter, and raised her, and then married her to Zayd bin Thabit. And then they had that son Kharija. Kharija took Abdurrahman bin Aflah into his house, who was not even a Sahabi, not even a son of a Sahabi. He happened to be a slave boy. But again, this tells us that there was no distinction made between slave or free. It was considered an honor. So Kharija, such a great Sahabi, having such a honorable nasab, connected with some of the great Sahaba of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, his mother being raised in the home of Abu Bakr Siddiq radiallahu anhu, he's taking this Abdurrahman into his home and raising him as a little child. His wife is the nursed Abdurrahman ibn Aflah. And Abdurrahman ibn Aflah obviously had spent time with Abu Ayyub Ansari radiallahu anhu as well. So it doesn't even seem like he's really being treated as a slave. He's being treated as just like a free man. In fact, even more respected than that. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam had a lot of love for two families from the Ansar. Does anybody know who they are? Of course, one of them is the family of Abu Ayyub Ansari radiyallahu anhu. And we'll talk about why he loved them so much later. But one of them was Abu Ayyub Ansari. Then who was the second family? Anyone know? Seems like everyone knows, but nobody wants to. Well, everybody's trying to give everybody else a chance to speak. So, Anas bin Malik radiallahu anhu's mother, Sulaym. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam had a lot of love and respect for Sulaym and her husband Abu Talha Al-Ansari radiallahu anhu. Often he would go to their home and they would invite them for da'wat. And sometimes if Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was in need of something, he didn't have any formality with them. He would go to their home as if it was his own house and ask them for his need or any help. And they were always there for him at all times. Sometimes he would do his afternoon nap, like his qaylula. He would spend it at the house of Sulaym radiallahu ta'ala anha and Abu Talha al-Ansari radiallahu anhu. So it's mentioned in this hadith, umirtu. He says, I have been given the order, an u'akhiya, that I establish ties. Now we hear in the rawayat, we have heard, and I mentioned just a little while ago, that when ties were established between Muhajir and Ansar, we always hear about ties being established between the men. So Sa'd bin Rabi' and Abdurrahman bin Auf radiyallahu anhuma. And likewise, we talked about Musab ibn Umair and who? Abu Ayyub Ansari radiyallahu anhu. We talked about that in the last session. And similarly, all Muhajirun were tied to one Sahabi from the Ansar. But have you ever heard of the women also from the Muhajirat being tied to somebody from one of the Ansar women folk? So Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam established ties between Fatima radiyallahu anha, the daughter of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and Sulaym radiyallahu ta'ala anha. So they became like sisters. Sulaym and Fatima bint Muhammad radiyallahu anhuma. Hani'an li Sulaym. Why did he do that? Out of respect and love for Sulaym. Because obviously anybody who knows that Sulaym, or a woman, is the sister of Fatima radiallahu ta'ala anha, and that tie of sisterhood has been established through Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, how much respect would they have in the eyes of the Sahaba and Sahabiyat? Immense. So it was an act that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam did to honor her, to show her respect. Sulaym radiallahu ta'ala anha. بِلُطْفِهَا بِرَسُولِ اللَّهِ because of her love and her compassion for Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. That's number one. وَأُمِرْتُ and I have been given the order, meaning it's coming from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. أَنْ أُآخِيَ بَيْنَ عَيْشَةَ بِنْتِ أَبِي بَكْرٍ وَبَيْنَ إِمْرَةِ أَبِي أَيُّوبَ الْأَنصَارِ that I establish ties of sisterhood between who? Aisha bint Abi Bakr Siddiq radiyallahu anhuma and the wife of Abu Ayyub Al-Ansari radiyallahu anh. We don't know her name, but she was known as Ayyub Al-Ansari radiyallahu ta'ala anhu, radiyallahu anha. And then he said, Ala jazallahu ala Abi Talhata wa ala Abi Ayyub an Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam khairan. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless and reward the family of Abu Talha, that is Sulaim's husband, and the family of Abu Ayyub from Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam in the best way. This was the dua that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam made for both families, in addition to establishing ties with the women of his home to Sulaim and Ayyub Ansari radiyallahu ta'ala anhuma, to show his respect and his love for these two families. There's a riwayah about Ayyub Ansari radiyallahu ta'ala anha that once Abu Ayyub Ansari radiyallahu anhu came to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam and he was having problems with Ayyub radiyallahu ta'ala anha. Issues with his wife. And he had decided that he wants to give her talaq. I want to divorce her. But he didn't want to do it just like that. Because in normal cases, Sahabi wants to give his wife, any person wants to give his talaq, you don't have to go to the elder. Right? Many Sahaba in the time of Rasulullah gave their women talaq. They never consulted with Rasulullah before. But Abu Ayyub Ansari did, because he knew the status of Ayyub Ansari with Rasulullah. So he had to be careful. And then she happened to be the sister of Aisha radiyallahu ta'ala anha, a tie that was established by Rasulullah by the order of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So he's not going to take any chances. Let me consult with Rasulullah first. So it's mentioned that Anna Ayyub arada an yutalliqa Ayyub. He wanted to give talaq, to divorce his wife. Faqala Rasulullah Ya Aba Ayyub. He says, O Abu Ayyub, Inna talaqa Ayyub hawbun. To give talaq to Ayyub is a big sin. It's a major sin. Hawb. The hadith, there's a dua that Rasulullah has taught us. Waghsil hawbati. Please purify me, wash me of my sin. Hawba. Same word. Inna talaqa Ayyuba hawbun. Even though giving talaq is permissible, he's calling it a sin. Don't dare. Don't even think about it. It's going to be a sin for you to separate from her and give her talaq. Allahu Akbar. There's a riwayah from Ayyub Ansari radiyallahu anha. Why did Rasulullah love her so much? Because you know that when Rasulullah made the hijrah, he stayed for a couple of months. The riwayah mention, historical narrations, not the hadith, that he was in the house of Abu Ayyub Ansari then for 7 months. For 7 months. Okay. For those 7 months, Rasulullah was staying at the lower level, ground level, while at the upper level, the second story, was occupied by Abu Ayyub Ansari radiyallahu anhu and his wife. And the reason Rasulullah wanted it that way was because then it would be easier for guests who came to visit Rasulullah to come and visit him, otherwise they have to go upstairs. So Rasulullah preferred it that way. We're going to mention the riwayat on that later. But Rasulullah preferred it that way. But Abu Ayyub Ansari then felt very uncomfortable about that. He mentioned it. But that's the way Rasulullah wanted it. So al-amru fawq al-adab. It's the order of Rasulullah, even though it's against the adab. But if it's the order, I will do what Rasulullah wants. But during that time, 6-7 months, who was taking care of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam in terms of all his needs, providing for his food? Ayyub Ansari Radhi-Allahu anha. So she narrates that once, فَتَكَلَّفْنَا لَهُ طَعَامًا فِيهِ شَيْءٌ مِّنْ هَذِهِ الْبُقُولِ. One time we made some nice dishes of food for him, which had some buqul. What is buqul? Vegetables like that have a little bit of a smell, like garlic, right? And onions. فَلَمَّا أَتَيْنَاهُ كَرِهَهُ. We brought it to him, he didn't like it. And he told the guests that were around him, لِأَصْحَابِي كُلُوا, eat. فَإِنِّي لَسْتُ كَأَحَدٍ مِّنْكُمْ, because I'm not like any one of you. إِنِّي أَخَافُ أَنْ أُوذِيَ صَاحِبِي. I fear that I may disturb my sahib, my companion, referring to Jibreel alayhi salatu wasalam. Because Jibreel alayhi salatu wasalam didn't make appointments when he came to Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam. I'm going to come to you at 5:30 p.m. He could come to him at any time. So it was important for Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam to always remain in a state that he could welcome Jibreel alayhi salatu wasalam. We all know the hadith that once Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was waiting for Jibreel alayhi salatu wasalam. Jibreel alayhi salatu wasalam told him, I would come to you to meet you, and he's waiting for him, and he didn't come. It's a hadith of Tirmidhi. He's waiting. Finally, Jibreel alayhi salatu wasalam told him, I can't come because there's a puppy hiding underneath your bed in your house. So Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam got rid of that, and then after that, Jibreel alayhi salatu wasalam came. So Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam had to be very careful about many things because Jibreel alayhi salatu wasalam could come to him at any time. And the angels are powerful beings made of nur, but still there are certain things that they don't like as well. In fact, the same things that human beings don't like, malaika don't like as well. They don't like going to the bathrooms. They don't like places of impurity. Just like shayateen love places of impurity, bathrooms, malaika don't like places of impurity. So somebody may say, okay, then I should just stay in the bathroom, I'll never die. Because the angel of death will never come upon me. So I'll stay in the bathroom all the time. So Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam had to be very, very careful all the time. So that's why even something that smelled bad or, gave bad breath, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam would not eat it. So if it had onions or garlic or anything of that sort, that could smell bad. And that same hukum applies to anybody who comes to the masjid. And it doesn't apply to only garlic and onions. Though that's what the hadith mentioned, it applies to anything that has a bad odor. For example, smoking. What else? Burping. Some people have a habit of they come to masjid and mashallah, they've just eaten, had their lunch, dinner, whatever, and then, they just take revenge on everybody in masjid. They take revenge on everybody in the masjid. Like, you did this to me, let me, you can have this. It disturbs people. And we do shukr for social distancing now. It has some benefits. This is one of the benefits that it does have. But it's not right. In fact, it's makruh. For the same reason that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, you come to the masjid, make sure you don't have bad odor. On your clothes, on your breath. Right? There's another riwayah related to that. So this riwayah, by the way, before I go on to the next riwayah, we don't have time now. This riwayah is narrated by Ayyub Ansari. So she did so much khidmat for Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam and served him. She had a place in the heart of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So when Abu Ayyub Ansari wanted to give her talaq, he said, there's no way. That's a sin. She's done so much khidmah. This person is one of the people of Jannah. You're not going to ever think of separating her, because that's not going to be good for you in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protect all of us. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us all a place with the Sahaba Ridwanullahi alayhim ajma'in on the day of resurrection. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala fill our hearts with love for the Sahaba Ridwanullahi alayhim ajma'in. Inshallah, next week on Wednesday, we will start talking about the hijrah and how Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam came to the house of Abu Ayyub Ansari radhiyallahu anhu, and a hadith related to that. Subhana rabbika rabbil izzati amma yasifun wa salamun ala al-mursalin walhamdulillahi rabbil alamin. Jazakumullah khair.